and on the other hand, it might harm other constitutional interests, especially the ideal of a democratic discourse. So when we think about regulatory options now, we have to keep this conflict in mind. Let's start with a brief look at the self-regulation of social media platforms. Both Facebook and Twitter prohibit the use of social bots by their terms of service. I have provided some of the relevant clauses on the slide. You don't have to read through all of this. What I'm interested in is if we need additional rules. Do we need public regulation even if the use of social bots is already protected by Twitter terms of condition or Facebook community standards? And I think the answer to this question is quite simple. The self-regulation of the platforms has to be appreciated, of course, but it does not release the democratic legislator from its responsibility for a functioning public discourse. It is quite obvious that the social networks don't take sufficient measures to fight social bots. Otherwise, we wouldn't constantly be witnessing manipulation attempts, and all of us, we wouldn't be here tonight. In my opinion, democratic states have to define the rules for online communication, and that is why legislators should set up a binding legal framework for social bots. So now how can such a regulation look like in practice? One regulatory approach that seems to be quite promising is the implementation of bot disclosure laws. For instance, the state of California has passed such a law last year. It says it shall be unlawful for any person to use a bot to communicate or interact with another person in California online with the intent to mislead the other person, etc. I leave the rest. And further it says in the end, a person using a bot shall not be liable under this section if the person discloses that it is a bot. So what we basically see here is an obligation to disclose bot communication. The use of social bots is not prohibited in general, but it has to be made transparent. I think there's a strong argument in favor of such a law. The risk of manipulation is significantly reduced once whoever uses a bot must disclose it. Because disclosure leads to more transparency and prevents the deception of other users. However, there is one big problem, and that is enforcement. As far as I know, and as also your research has shown, there's still no method by which social bots can be reliably detected. Neither research institutions nor the platforms themselves have yet developed an effective detection tool. Basically, we are playing an everlasting cat and mouse game, which in the end probably won't be won. But if bots cannot be identified, the enforcement of a bot disclosure obligation won't be possible either. In the end, the law has mainly a symbolic character, because a person who actually runs a manipulation campaign is not very likely to comply if the probability of legal sanction is almost zero. So next step, I would like to draw your attention to a law that is currently under discussion in Germany and will probably enter into force next summer. The federal states have agreed on a bot disclosure statute. I don't want to go into detail here. Basically, there will be an obligation to disclose all kinds of automated communication within social networks. So in principle, the law is in its structure quite similar to the Californian one, which we just have discussed. But there's one interesting difference that could prove to be very significant in the end. Because in contrast to the Californian approach, the German law not only obliges individual users, but also explicitly addresses the platform providers. The respective statute says that intermediaries who operate a social network must ensure that automated communication is disclosed. And I think this part is quite interesting. Suddenly we are not talking about bot regulation, but about platform regulation as well. And for sure, this approach certainly does not solve all the problems, and enforcement will remain difficult enough. However, the platform operators are the actors who are best equipped to set up a functioning detection system and to fight social bots, and that's why, in my opinion, it certainly makes sense to oblige them to become more active in this area. So I think this is a rather good approach. One final remark before I come to an end. I think social bots are a phenomenon that cannot be addressed with isolated measures. Instead, we need a multi-dimensional approach. A well-balanced legal framework against social bots is a good first step, but regulation on a national level probably won't be enough. An international approach would be much more effective, so I personally hope that we can at least work out a common approach within the European Union. Let's see if that will be possible. Further, we need, Niva already mentioned, we need to strengthen digital literacy, of course. People have to know that not everything they are reading online is the truth. We need to build awareness on fake news, disinformation, and social bots. And last but not least, we need further research in this area. As your results also have shown, it's very important to research this field. We have to understand what influence digital disinformation actually has on democratic processes and how we can take action against it. And that's all from me for now.
Great.
Happy for questions.
Thank you.
Okay,
Amnon.
Thank you for this very interesting research and analysis. I have some very short comments. First, I think that as an analytical matter, the fact that software is written is not a sound enough basis for considering it as speech. That is because the fact that software is written doesn't mean that it is it's a communicative tool between two human beings. The fact we can read it, right? So I think you have a point that it is a tool for the communication of speech. Just like a TV may be a tool, or the radio may be a tool, but so I wouldn't base it on that. It's more on the broadcasting, on the notion of broadcasting, so that's just a minor technical point. On a more substantive point, I'm not sure that equality is where you want to go. This seems to be the turning point for your normative analysis. You said, well, there's all that, but then there is equality, and the reason being that you can start an arms race. You can say, well, equality, let everybody manipulate. We can use manipulation across the board, and then it's equal. We equally manipulate everybody. So equality in and of itself is not. It is something about the authenticity. It is about agency. It is about autonomy. It is about something there. And this is why you go for disclosure, because disclosure is not a tool for, it doesn't solve the equality problem. Disclosure talks about the quality of the discourse. And then finally, my last comment, again, is more stylistic, but because I share your conclusions, and I have one last comment about institutions. The fact that compliance is a problem, you can never eradicate it, in and of itself is not a good idea. It's not sufficient. Why? Because you say, well, if I have 80% compliance, that's good. So even if we don't detect 100% of the bots, but 80% of the bots, maybe that's good. It doesn't mean we shouldn't, just because we're not going to be able to detect the rest of the 20%. And the fact that we don't have an incentive, the incentive to comply is zero, is not necessarily so, because if you have disclosure, and then you can trace it back, so it's an issue of forensics. If you can trace it back to a political party, the damage, including expressive damage, can be huge, and therefore it changes the structure of the incentives. Fine. So I think the point to connect the two pieces we've heard is it has to be some institutional approach to what, an ongoing institutional approach to what do we do with bots, in the sense that you have to have media and civil society and computer science experts and all that ongoing. So it's not, if we think that the law will do it and courts will, that there has to be an element, a layer there of institutionalized, ongoing, institutionalized doesn't mean just state, but it can be of an ongoing surveillance, counter-surveillance, in the sense that to the extent there are bots, we have to use surveillance mechanisms to use the counter-surveillance of the bots. So that's why I think that's my normative.
Yeah, all points are good. Concerning the first question or comment, you're absolutely right. Not every software is speech, but actually that's what I want to argue. Software or coding can be a form of expressing oneself. Not every software code is speech. And the second question, what was the second question?
About quality.
Okay. You're absolutely right. That's democracy. Like, everybody wants to have influence. That's normal. And also manipulation is nothing new. I think we had manipulation also the ancient Greece also had manipulation. You're absolutely right. But I think we also have in democracy this ideal of a equal discourse. That doesn't mean that we have to pursue it to the end, but still I think it is a normative aspect which we have to keep in mind. In how far, you're right, I'm not sure in how far we should go there. Yeah, and also the last one is very interesting because I'm a big fan of this sociologist approach to say that also a symbolic law is a law, and it might have effect. I think that's a really interesting point, and I also talked with a few sociologists in Berlin in our institute, and they confirmed it. Definitely. Thanks.
One.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. When it comes to manipulative bot speech, you argue that it presents us with the need to balance between freedom of expression and democratic ideals. Okay. However, one of the main theoretical bases or rationales of freedom of expression itself is the promotion of democratic ideals, public discourse. So your critique could actually be seen, or should be seen, as a critique from within free speech theory, and not from outside. Because the question then becomes, what is the theoretical basis for protecting bot speech? And if it's not democracy, then it should come from somewhere else. It's not the attainment of truth, I suppose, and perhaps that it's autonomy. But then the question is, once again, should we differentiate between states, corporations, and individuals when it comes to autonomy? So the question is, where does the protection for social bots come from in the first place? So I don't see that so much as a balance between democracy and freedom of expression, because I'm looking for the theoretical justification for protecting that speech in the first place.
That's also a good point. And it's also a point I'm thinking about a lot, and that's also a question which I haven't solved because the democratic approach is one way, but in Germany we also think about if like public discourse is a part of free speech, like an objective part of free speech. So we have like an individual right for free speech, but it also goes on like an objective sphere. I haven't decided on that yet, but you're right. Also, autonomy is very important here, and also if we talk about manipulation, autonomy is definitely a thing which we have to keep in mind.
I want to ask two questions. One is about deception. I'm not familiar with German law, but I know, for example, in the US, there is a law that prohibits deception by state agencies against the public, but obviously it's not enforced. In Israel, obviously, state agencies routinely deceive the public. So the question is, if we don't look at social media as a unique and special arena, should it be enforced also on state agencies, the issues of deception? The second question, which perplexed me, was about the definition of social. I understand social media, I understand social bot, but I was surprised to see that in your ground law you had the definition of the Federal Republic as a democratic and social state. What does it mean?
So, a short remark on the first question concerning state authorities. In my work, I'm not looking so much on state actors because I'm more interested in the fundamental rights conflict. However, you're right. If we have a state authority who uses deception, we need to be even more strict with that. But then we are not in this fundamental rights regime because state authorities are not holders of fundamental rights.
But do you have a specific law in Germany prohibiting state agencies from deceiving the public?
I would guess so, and if not, we can directly take that from the Constitution, I think.
And on the social definition in the...
Yeah, just the social one, I think that's a very... that's a thing that is probably quite interesting for the German Constitution. It has nothing to do with the democratic principles. So we have the principle of democracy and the principle of the social welfare in general. So that's also a very broad term, but it is something we wrote in our constitution to pursue social. So it
refers to welfare state?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay, go ahead.
Do you, by any chance, refer to the conflict between the quantitative and the qualitative aspect of both? I mean, the quantitative refer to the amount of cases that you may find as bots and what should be the actual punishment towards them.
So I'm a lawyer. I'm not doing any empirical research. What I do is I look in the reports and all the results of studies, but I'm not really doing empirical research myself. Or what do you mean with the difference between quantitative?
The entire phenomenon. That's the general descriptive definition that may give another point of view towards the entire problem.
I mean, I try to look what is written on social bots in communication science and political science, but we don't have... Social bots is a phenomenon which is very hard to get hold of in an empirical way, but also the research here shows. So all the studies are quite... It's very difficult to tell if the results are right. So I try to step back and just research it from a legal point of view.
I think what was really interesting is that in the regulation that is now introduced in Germany, you're going to have a duty that is imposed on social media to actually disclose social bots. And I think that is where those of us who worked on this felt that social media is in conflict of interest, that it requires some court intervention or media pressure, because in fact they profit from it, right? I mean, it's more engagement, it's more action. We seem to be, it's like it's actually something they need to get the right incentives, and I think maybe this is a way to go about this. We have just like very quick question because we need to.
Yeah, just because refers to that law. What's the status right now of it? And what were the reactions of the social media companies? I would be interested in that. Like, did they make any statements about about these plans?
I don't think that anything will change because it is the Medienstaatsvertrag, and it has to enter into force next summer. And they were discussing this thing since, I don't know, like I think 2 years now. And it seems that the wording, how it's now, will stand in the end, but who knows?
Very interesting. Important to publish it in English too. Okay, we're going to take a break now. Thank you very much. Thank you. Drinks and some goodies, and we will convene here at 6 to discuss AI. רגע, אני רוצה להגיד לא הצליחו לקדם.
אבל בסופו של דבר, אלה שכתבו את הקוד שפותח את ההצפנה של ה-DVD, הוא עם הקבוצות של הקוד, זה לא עוזר. הנקודה שלך היא כמובן נכונה ברמה, אבל רק כנקודת פתיחה. כל דיבור פוליטי הוא מניפולציה. עכשיו השאלה מה ההבדל במצב שלנו. בהנחה שכל פרסום, כל תעמולה פוליטית, כל זה נועד לשכנע. נועד לך לעשות מניפולציה ברמה של... תחשוב על זה ותרגיש מה שאני מרגיש ומה היה? אז עכשיו, בהנחה שאתה לא יכול to detach, you can fully detach, extract, the manipulated component of politics. לא, זה עניין האם יכולה להיות לך נכון? לא, זה לא רק עניין של רעיון, זה עניין קונספטואלי. אם הקונספט הוא, אני צריך לשכנע אותך, ואז אתה הולך למה זה שכנוע, back to the Greeks, ואתה אומר, זה אומנות המניפולציה, כשאומר לך אריסטו מה זה רטוריקה. טוב, אז עכשיו השאלה היא, given that manipulation is built in, the question is whether you have to deceive about your identity. But that's okay. So once you put it back into democratic theory by saying that in theory if you cannot manipulate and all talk is rational talk, but since not all talk is more rational talk, in fact political talk is by definition, it contains an irreducible irrational element. Then the question of deception is raised, it can become a question. Do I have now to disclose? It is deception of identity an inherent component of the protected part of manipulation, because to manipulate is protected.
Socialism. And that is a lot of sense to understand how in this field we do have to amplify the...
בוא נסתכל על זה גם מבחינת קונספטואלית. שחשבתי עליו. בסדר. התיאוריה אומרת שסרטים עושים לך סספנשן דיסבליף.
After saying that, agree
כל העולם שסרט נכנס לעולם
Freud is
זה אור עכשיו רגע נשמע אז יש פה איזשהו אלמנט של סספנשן דיסבליף. עכשיו השאלה היא רגע
measure that we should, at the end of the day, that's what led me towards the question and the solution.
That's also why it's so we work so hard.
So I hope I haven't.
No, it's fine.
No, that it was not embarrassing to.
No, not at all. No.
כדי שהדבר הזה יעבוד, יש ערך אינסטרומנטלי, יש ערך אינסטרומנטלי, זה
sharing the
אתה יודע שזה בוט שאתה רק תעשה לא תעשו את זה,
German by my own
שהבוט הזה
citizenship.
נכון, בגלל שאתה בא בגלל שאתה עושה סקיילינג, אתה צריך את זה. זה המהלך המחשבתי, המהלך המחשבתי, כמו שאתה מבין, כיוון שהיא נותנת לך בורת כעס, אתה מגן על זה. אין ערך שנראית טלוויזיה כטלוויזיה, עכשיו אני יכול להגיע לכל בית.
But I heard you. Oh, you were there. Okay. So היכולת להיכנס, but my child is so affected with dad and my dad. I'm sorry, but that sucks. Okay, well, and I enjoyed hearing about it.
אולי אני כבר לא יכול להכין את זה.
So what do I do?
No, not everyone. Again, on the qualitative and quantitative level, not everyone is.